Okay, welcome to Sabbath School this morning. We want to welcome back Paul Herrmann, who has spoken with us one other time, and he and his wife attend the Sabbath School. He is presenting on the last chapter of Bruinsma's book.
All right, thank you much. Can you all hear okay in the back?
Yes.
All right, and let me know if you can't see, and I'll turn the lights down a little bit, but I think we should be okay.
Alan said, don't touch the lights.
Oh, well, I stand corrected then. All right, so we're going to deal with the last chapter of Bruinsma's book. The title of the chapter is Dealing with Our Doubts, but as we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the family vacation that I took this summer. We went to Boise, Idaho, and I think most people are aware Boise is the state capital of Idaho. This is the Capitol building, and they have a very interesting display. Idaho politics were about as rough and tumble as they got. A very stereotypical Western experience to becoming a state. Very proud of their state, not a lot of people around, very different than visiting the California state Capitol building. But their capital is built predominantly out of marble, with the exception of these pillars, which look fantastic. The small pillars are marble, the big ones are painted wood. So my compliments to the artist, because until I went up and actually tapped on it, I didn't know it wasn't marble. Part of the reason we went to Boise is because it's actually a fairly multicultural city, and it has within it a Basque cultural center. And when I was a kid growing up in Ritchie Canyon here, there were some Basque shepherds that used to come by from time to time, and so it seemed like kind of a neat thing to go find out a little bit about the cultural heritage. The shepherds that came used to live in these trailers that they have an example of in the background there. These were people who had immigrated, and when they came to the U.S., they came in on visas specifically designed for shepherds, because apparently America was a little light on shepherds. The cultural heritage is absolutely fascinating, and we were very fortunate. We happened to roll into Boise the weekend they were having their actual cultural weekend. So there were a number of dances in the street. They start them young and then raise them up, and this is getting ready to begin a mass. They've been granted the Boise Cathedral for the day. This is a picture of their flag, and then this is something that you see in the Northwest if you hike. They would carve various images into trees, and the scar tissue would leave a sign or symbol, and this one is estimated to be about 20-25 years old. It would be 10 or 15 years before the tree would develop after it had been carved. So even though they were serving as shepherds, they had a definite sense of sort of making something permanent in the environment. I found them particularly fascinating because their language is an isolate. There is no other known European language that is linked to it. Genetically, they are thought to be some of the oldest peoples that are indigenous to Europe, that are still in Europe. And they reside in the mountains between Spain and France, and like most people who reside in the mountains, the U.S. being no exception, they're a very independent lot. But the reason I'm bringing this here today is as we crossed the town, we had to go past a psychic fair. And not only was it a psychic fair, but that particular day was the Goddess Fest. And as we were walking along, we passed a particular booth, and my 11-year-old was the first to express the sentiment that we'll be talking about today. This is the booth for lost kids. If you lose your kids at the psychic fair, you can come meet up at the booth. And my 11-year-old said, how psychic can they possibly be? Which leads to today's topic, dealing with our doubts. So this is an outline of Bruinsma's chapter. Starts with an introduction. In the introduction, he gives a very brief summary of his entire book. He then moves on to discuss various approaches to resolving spiritual doubt. Winds toward the end of the chapter with a sort of personal journey, closes with a list of what he considers to be the fundamental beliefs for his particular sense of belonging within Adventism, And I would say the overall theme of the chapter is there's a direction to consider one's own fundamentals, what one considers to be at the heart of their religion. Within the spiritual approach, he makes some fairly poignant remarks, points out that doubt in the spiritual context must be dealt with both rationally as well as emotionally, can't be handled individually. You have to have both. He then talks about 5 approaches. It's a fairly practical chapter. The 5 approaches consist of reading, thinking, praying, talking with others, and having patience. And then he comes back to sort of a wrap up on the last chapter I described, states that you have to start with a leap of faith. In his section on Bible reading, he talks about the difference between studying and reading the Bible. And he said that many times people focus very much on studying the Bible, breaking the text down into ever smaller pieces and getting a better and better understanding of the small pieces. Tremendous focus on detail, but points out that sometimes we may miss the tremendous value of the Scripture when we do that, because when we read, we realize that it's a collection of stories and books. It can be read like any other book, and he believes that reading it in this manner, recognizing the overarching theme of God's leading of his people, and not being as focused on the details, leads to a closer spiritual understanding and a diminution of the doubts that plague people. He used a nifty example of the difference between studying and reading with a Van Gogh painting, which I'm not sure you can see very well, but it's called The Potato Eaters. When you look at it, he pointed out most people pick up on the mood, the sort of sense of despair, the darkness, and almost nobody, when you turn the photo off, is able to tell you how many potatoes were on the table. And he said this painting was not painted to tell you how many potatoes there were there. It was painted to show you the sense of despair and darkness and loneliness. And so by analogy, he says the Bible should be read not for the individual details so much as to try and get the overarching theme. He then moves on to a section on thinking, points out that common sense is very, very important. This fits with the Protestant heritage that we talked about last time of the Bible being able to be understood in a plain reading. So he mentions common sense is important. References a concept from Dr. Guy, tripolar thinking, saying that when one is attempting to make sense of one's faith, they have to take into account the Christian gospel, their own cultural context, the Adventist heritage, because that's a big part of it, Adventist cultural context, and through looking at it that way, one can make sense of their place in the universe. And then Bruinsma reminds us toward the end of the section that Christ needs to be kept central in one's studies. He makes a nice foray, although very brief, into Ellen White, provides an extremely brief overview of how she's been viewed by the church through the years, suggests that readers might wish to take a fresh look at her and leave the baggage behind. And he recommends 3 books that he thinks are well worth the read. Again, he recommends reading them in this same approach of looking at the overarching work, maybe not being quite so careful of the detail, but he particularly recommended Steps to Christ, Christ Objects, Lessons, and Desire of Ages. And my father happened to hand me a Steps to Christ as I was telling him I was preparing the lecture, and there's actually a chapter within it labeled What to Do with Doubt. And it's not a bad chapter. Points out there is a big place for evidence, and in the very New England tradition points out that emotion without reason does not, nor should it, be expected to dispel one's doubts, which fits back in with what Bruinsma pointed out. You need to deal with the intellect as well as the emotional content if you wish to resolve spiritual doubt. He then talks about prayer. I particularly like the fact that he gave a recipe for people who are trying to start a prayer life or improve a prayer life. Many people aren't entirely comfortable with prayer, and so he suggests if you're one of those people, start by repeating the Lord's Prayer. After all, it was put in it as an example of how to pray. After one has done that and become comfortable with it, then no reason one shouldn't pray or ask for guidance while reading Scripture. And as one develops in their prayer life, they will ultimately get to a point when they can talk directly with God about their doubts which fits with our view of God as a relational God. His next section is a four-step approach of how to deal with our questions of doctrine that all of us probably face. The first of the steps is to formulate the questions clearly. I thought this was a good point. There's a lot of people who kind of get off and running, but they don't understand exactly what it is they're questioning. So he says you really need to formulate your questions, make them very clear, then honestly seek answers to the questions, take whatever answers one has been able to find, fit the evidence and beliefs into the larger context of their life and spiritual journey, and then ultimately don't forget to recommit oneself to the faith. He starts to wind the chapter down by asking what is the most important doctrines to you. Mentions that as you undergo this exercise, you should consider your own journey of faith, consider specifically what it is you believe, and he sees no harm in making and editing one's own list of beliefs, and he has in the back of the chapter a list of 14 beliefs that he holds particularly dear within the Seventh-day Adventist faith and tradition. So that's an outline of the chapter. It ties up the book very nicely because of the nice review and pulling the themes together. And with that, I'll move on into some thoughts of my own. This is my charming middle son who managed to get a hold of a magic marker when he was very young. I think Sarah's very happy that it did not turn out to be a Sharpie, so it washed off in a week as opposed to 6. But anyway, I'm going to indulge a little bit in my own self-expression. So looking at philosophy and doubt. Doubt has played a big role in the Western tradition, both secularly as well as religiously. If we stop and look at Western philosophy, we find that there are two areas where doubt or skepticism has been particularly important. The first is methodological skepticism, and this particular form of philosophical doubt subjects all claims of any knowledge whatsoever to doubt. It's the basis of Descartes' philosophical thinking, and we've all probably heard his English version of the Latin, I think, therefore I am. Often people say, what's philosophy? I think, therefore I am. Most people don't realize that Descartes is using doubt here to point out that if you have something to doubt, there has to be something there. And so by using this, he can use only deductive reasoning to bootstrap his way into some sort of reality around him. The more common branch of philosophical skepticism is not the methodological process, but the philosophical, meaning that there's an assumption knowledge exists, but any perceived certain knowledge is questioned and doubted. It starts with Sextus Empiricus of Greek origin, I believe 400 or 500 years before Christ. Sextus Empiricus was the first to sort of question how you know the claims of a person making claims happen to be true. And it appears that this may be the basis in this Gospel of John when Christ is before Pilate. Pilate asks him if he's a king. Christ says, "Thou sayest that I am, and I'm here to show truth." And then Pilate makes the comment, "What is truth?" It's been a very debated statement as to what exactly Pilate meant. But one of the perceptions is this goes back to Sextus Empiricus' approach of, how do I know what you're telling me is true as opposed to what everybody else is telling me is true? And then, of course, at the end, Pilate walks out and says that I find no basis of fault. Anyway, Augustine picked up on this and started looking at when you have discrepancies between what one knows to be true from the world around them and their own experience and what one reads in the scripture, how can one deal with the conflict there? Montaigne looked at doubt and used it to revolutionize child's education. Up to that point, children were taught basically to memorize and regurgitate what they had memorized. And Montaigne was the first to say that if you want true knowledge in a child, you have to actually allow the child to question everything and then work through those questions, and from that process, figure out what's real and what's not real. Even though it's about 400 years old, Montaigne's theories actually form the basis of, I believe, most elementary education in America today. Marcion used the concept of doubt to argue with the mystical and occultist thinkers, considered science to be descriptive. I think when Peter objected to the lost persons booth at the psychic fair, he was probably in the tradition of Marcion. Hobbes looked and used doubt to be one of the foundations of modern political philosophy. Part of the American political system rests on Hobbes' views, and they came from the fact that Hobbes started to actually doubt the divine right of kings. Spinoza wrote a lot about science. He's probably the father of the deterministic view of science, that if you get outside of quantum mechanics is sort of what we assume to be the case. If I know where an object is, I know how fast it's going, I should be able to predict where it lands. The concept that one could even do that goes back to Spinoza and his doubting and demanding that things be made very clear. And then finally we come to, and I don't know whether you say Bayle or Bayle, I believe he's a French philosopher, and he claimed, based on studies of doubt, that due to the limits of human reason, conscience alone should be viewed as reliable. So you see that the concept of doubt in the Western heritage has had a profound impact on our lives, our experiences, what we consider to be true, and as you go through the list, you can see that it also has had an impact on our religious views within Christianity and Seventh-day Adventism. Now, for Dr. Lamberton, because I very much appreciate him coming, I had to put in some psychological perspectives. You recall the last time we mentioned Freud viewed faith as not in a particularly positive light. Well, Freud also doesn't view doubt in a particularly positive light either. Claims it's a symptom of a phobia emanating from the ego that was attributed to something that happened in childhood. So Freud doesn't give a lot of grace to either doubt or faith. So you're, I don't know, kind of left wondering what to do. There are a number of cognitive and spiritual approaches that people have designed to deal with psychological issues of doubt. The concept of behavioral therapy in psychology, if you look at it very closely, appears maybe more to a non-psychologist than a psychologist as really a Socratic method that's used to attempt to help a person recognize what's maladaptive and better behaviors. In Eastern thought, doubt is attributed to an over-attachment to one's perceived past and future, and the meditation that people undergo is often used to attempt to break those attachments and get rid of the doubt. I think that's a very clear distinction between the Eastern perspective of doubt and the Western. The Western has embraced it and used it as a tool, where the Eastern thought appears to attempt to just push it away and distance oneself and not deal with it. All right, I always look up whatever topic I'm speaking on in Wikipedia, largely because it's a fantastic entity. You can click on all the blue words and just drift for hours. Looks like you're studying, and you could be having a wonderful time. But if you look up doubt in Wikipedia, it put up a web page that really surprised me. Claimed that doubt is a mental state where the mind is suspended between two contradictory propositions. Reason, so the part we've been talking a lot about with regard to philosophy, attempts to examine the facts and evidence in order to determine which of those two propositions is more correct. The emotional approach, according to Wikipedia, really, when you talk about doubt, it's an indecision between whether one believes or doesn't believe. So it's not a disbelief so much as it's an indecision as to whether they believe or don't believe. Points out that the early Christian view considered doubt to be the voice of an uncertain conscience. Goes further to say doubt calls on reason, but it encourages hesitation, and it demands very rigorous methods in order to get resolution. Politics, ethic, and law, particularly in the West, place great importance on doubt, and there are very elaborate methods that have been put in place that are adversarial in order to try and resolve doubt. And this is the basis of our proved beyond a reasonable doubt that we deal with in the courtroom. And then it talks about something called societal doubt. Points out that we currently live in an atmosphere of supreme distrust, It's accusatory in nature as opposed to just being distrustful. And according to Wikipedia, this has been fostered in Western Europe since the Enlightenment. And so what we're dealing with now is sort of the natural expectation of where we would be based on having fostered that concept of societal doubt. All right, origin of the English word. Old English word Tweonian, changed to the Middle English word Tweonian, which appears to me to be only a change in spelling, but you get the sense that there's two, the number 2 lurking in there. When the Normans came in and invaded, they brought in a lot of French words with them, and so they replaced the Tweonian with the word doubter, D-O-U-T-E-R, which came from the Old French doubter, and the Latin dubitare, which is from dubito. Sure, I'm butchering the pronunciation of all of these, but the concept is, it comes from the concept of two and holding, so holding two things at the same time. So the English word doubt sort of fits with what we saw in the Wikipedia article. If you look it up in an English dictionary and you look for synonyms, there are a whole host of them, but almost all of them yields the sense of two competing ideas. But in addition to the competing ideas, there's a very healthy dose of indecisiveness and hesitancy. So it's undecided, double-minded, make very good synonyms. And it's that undecided hesitancy that I would like to spend most of the time dealing with my thoughts on. I remember years ago, when I was in graduate school, they were selling, they had a whole list of the banned books. And that it was basically the banned book sale. And one of these books was called The Art of War. So I had never heard of The Art of War, and so picked up the book. It was set down about 700, somewhere between 770 and 470 before Christ by a person named Sun Tzu, who was thought to be a Chinese general of some renown. Formalized in written form somewhere around the 5th century BC. It consists of 13 chapters. It's the most influential strategy text in East Asian warfare that's ever been written. Translated into French in 1772 by a Jesuit named Jean-Joseph Marie Herriot, and actually it was at that point that it became banned, because the first line in it says, "All war is based on deception," which put war and the Judeo-Christian heritage in real conflict. First annotated English text was by Lionel Giles in 1910, but it has been claimed to have inspired Mao Zedong, Takeda Shinzen, and most recently Norman Schwarzkopf. And if you look at his strategy and approach to the First Gulf War, it reads almost like a playbook out of the book as to what he did, when he did it, and how he did it. One of the major themes in this book is that when one is in war, they need to keep the opponent indecisively weighing two equal options. It doesn't matter to Sun Tzu whether they are two very good options or two very bad options. Either way, the opponent is left in a sense of indecision, trying to decide which way to go. And while they're indecisively standing there paralyzed, you can sweep in and declare a victory. To me, this rings particularly poignant with regard to doubt in the religious context, particularly when we think of a great controversy concept that has pervaded the Adventist theology. Doubt is a problem not so much in entertaining the doubt as in the indecision and the hesitancy that the doubt leads to. I looked up doubt in a concordance and found there are only 5 references that are translated as the English word doubt in English. All 5 of them come from the New Testament. No 2 of them come from the same Greek word. In Matthew 14:31, we have the concept of doubt when Peter's walking on the water and he starts to sink. Christ chides him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Later on in Matthew, when the disciples are asking about miracles, Christ tells them, if you had faith and told this mountain to stand up and do not doubt, the mountain would go throw itself into the sea. In Mark we have a very similar statement regarding doubt, probably the same story. And then in Acts 2, we encounter the word in association with the day of Pentecost. So the disciples, as you recall, are speaking in tongues and prophesying and really swept away in the Spirit. And the Gentiles arrived, and it said some doubted, all were amazed, and some stated they thought they were drunk. And then there's the famous speech by Peter. In Galatians 4, we have Paul speaking with regard to the role of the law, and he says, I stand in doubt of you. I'm not sure you and I are of the same faith. Again, no two of the references use the same word in Greek, but what struck me is the very rare usage of the word in all of Scripture, when in fact there are a number of stories that in my mind speak to doubt and working through doubt, both in the Old and New Testament. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to look at some of them. The first one, which is actually my favorite story in all of the Bible, is the story of Belshazzar's feast, because that statement, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. I really like that, right? It's not you're a couple of bricks shy of a full load, not something's missing. You've been weighed in the balance and you've been found wanting. And I put this in here because when you look at it, it speaks to that double-minded, you've been weighed in a balance. There's two ways you could have gone here, and you went the wrong one. So this is a painting by Rembrandt. There's another painting of Daniel before Belshazzar by West, which focuses much more on the lack of doubt of Daniel. So you have Daniel who comes into the dining hall, describes what's on the wall, points out that it's the end of the king. He's basically offered the entire kingdom, and it doesn't really matter to Daniel. Truth is the truth. Title's completely immaterial. In my mind, that's the epitome of no doubt. There's no two positions Daniel's way. There's nothing to consider there. There's another story that's attributed to Daniel, which has yielded a Rembrandt painting, but we don't find it in the Bible we ordinarily read. It's found in the Apocrypha in a book called Bel and the Dragon. And there's a nifty little painting by Rembrandt down at the Getty that I think is one of my favorite Rembrandt paintings. And here it is. So the story in Bel and the Dragon is that when Cyrus showed up in Babylon, he was heavily manipulated by a group of priests who convinced him that they worshipped a real God, because every night they would have the king place a feast in a room, they would lock all the doors, and the next night king would come back in and the food would be gone, and so therefore the gods had eaten it. And Daniel, according to this paraphrase telling of the story, told the king, no, there is nothing there. You're being manipulated by charlatans. And so they put the food in, and then Daniel sprinkles ash all over the floor and locks the door. And the next morning, Cyrus and Daniel go back in, and there are, lo and behold, footprints all over the floor. So clearly it wasn't a god that ate the food, it was the priests that were sneaking in by another entryway. But I've always liked the picture, and this picture of the picture doesn't really do justice, because the look on the face is just absolutely perfect of somebody who has believed something one way their whole life, and now they're confronted with an evidence that they cannot deny, and it's just the starting of the dawning of that sense that Daniel worships the true God while the king has been duped all these years. Other instances where we dealt with doubt, Bruinsma referenced the story of John the Baptist sending disciples to Christ to find out if he was the true Savior or if they should be waiting for another. The doubt that John must have been feeling there would be immense. In prison, likely not to survive, although he may or may not have known that, and wondering if it had all been in vain or not. I can't imagine any darker sense of doubting. But Christ provides at least verbal evidence that this is the correct. He tells them to watch and see what's going on and then go back and tell John. So at least John has a witness that what he has been striving for is of value. Another story Bruinsma mentions, which is actually my favorite story of doubt, is the story of Thomas. We always talk about Thomas and we tend to vilify him a little bit. We talk about a doubting Thomas. He just doesn't get a lot of really good press. And yet when we look at that story, there's something in it that I take great hope in, and that is Christ has no problems showing Thomas what Thomas wants to see in order to work through his doubt. So a recognition that some people need things in order to be able to step through their doubt in faith. Another example that I have thought interesting is the one of David, particularly David after Bathsheba has given birth to the son. He's been told the son is going to die. He's in terrible mourning. The son dies, up whistling, dressed, everything's fine. They ask him why, and he said, well, there was a chance, but now the chance is over, and there's no reason to keep dwelling on it. I don't know why, I've always liked that story, but it speaks to a situation where somebody is faced with a doubtful situation and they took action both ways. When there was hope of changing God's mind, David was willing to put forth the effort to make that change. When all hope was lost, David was now ready to move on and quit questioning. Probably, though, in all of Scripture, the most bold story regarding doubt is the story regarding Paul and his decision to go to Rome. When you go through Acts, as you recall, he's working his way increasingly up the political food chain, and I believe it's when he's in front of Agrippa that he demands to be tried in Rome. The people, when you read the story, the disciples around him and the apostles pleaded with him not to go to Rome. So they told him that the Spirit had shown them he should not go to Rome. And yet Paul stands there, pounds his fist on the table, and says, I'm going to Rome. So we have an example of tremendous action and decision by a very strong character in the face of what otherwise would be a very competing and confusing pathway. Dr. Larson, a couple of weeks ago, asked me in presenting this chapter if I wouldn't mention an essay written by a philosopher named William James. It is, in fact, an interesting essay. We'll get to it in a minute, but I think we need a little bit of context first. William James is thought to be the father of American psychology. He was a professor at Harvard, lived from 1842 to 1910, and studied both philosophy and psychology. He was the first educator to offer a psychology course within the United States, wrote a number of books that deal with faith and philosophy. One of them, I think, is called The Variety of Religious Experience? He was a founding member of a philosophical school known as Pragmatism, and I think it's very important to recognize this before we touch on the essay. Pragmatism was started by William James, John Dewey, and Charles Saunders Peirce. They had a very pragmatic maxim, hence the word pragmatism. Their maxim was, consider the practical effects of the objects of your conception. Then your conception of those effects is the whole of your conception of the object. So basically they viewed thought as an important instrument for prediction, and particularly for prediction that leads to action. They did not consider thought to have any role in simply describing or representing reality. So from this school of thought, looking at a religion, it wouldn't matter where the religion came from, wouldn't matter what the history of the religion was. What would matter is whether or not that religion addressed any practical problems going forward. So with that in mind, I'll speak briefly on the essay, The Will to Believe, that Dr. Larson asked me to introduce. It was an essay published in 1896. It's a fairly long essay. He talks about a couple of things, though, that are pretty important. The first is he talks about the difference between a live versus a dead hypothesis. So you can have whatever hypothesis you want, but if there's absolutely no willingness for you to accept the outcome, there's no point in holding that hypothesis. So we live in Western Europe. If you were to visit the island somewhere in the South Sea where they had a very spiritual and non-Western religion, and they were to present you with a hypothesis that there was a particular demon in the grove, chances are good a Westerner wouldn't bother to waste their time with the hypothesis, because even if they showed all the evidence in the world, it's a dead hypothesis to somebody in the Western tradition. So a live hypothesis is one that you could take action based upon if you were convinced of it. In this article, William James argues that the access to the evidence that is required for or against one to hold a belief requires one to initially believe in order to even access the evidence. In other words, for belief to be a live hypothesis, you have to first assume it's real and then look for the evidence for or against it. And he makes a very nice logical argument as to why this is not a terrible thing to do, because in the day that this was written, that was viewed as getting very much into the realm of superstition. His thesis statement within the essay is, our passional nature not only lawfully may, and by lawfully he's speaking philosophically soundly, so our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say, under such circumstances, do not decide, but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing the truth. And then he comes back around basically saying, in religion, it's perfectly acceptable to make an a priori decision that you're going to believe it, and then start looking for the evidence. And the reason is, William James is all about action. You need to break through the indecision of whether it's real or not before you can gain anything from that religion. I'm going to sort of move on into the faith chapter one more time, but I wanted to look very briefly at a portion that's mentioned in there related to the rescue of Moses. So I was not aware, until I was poking around looking for some nice pictures, that the princess that adopted Moses in the royal court actually has a name in the Old Testament. But it's actually not in the part of the Old Testament we usually read in the Pentateuch. It's found in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, namely 1st Chronicles, and her name is Bithiah. So here's a painting of Bithiah taking Moses. The scripture, as well as the Jewish tradition, have had a long history of trying to figure out what to do with Bithiah, because she clearly was a heathen, didn't worship the true God, and yet interacted with Judaism in a way that had a very profound impact on it. Bottom line, though, is it's an example of somebody who took action in the face of uncertainty. And so to kind of wind down, I thought I'd go back to the faith chapter and something that Dave Larson mentioned last time I spoke. And that was when you read through this chapter in Hebrews 11, it says, by faith, and then there's a statement. And Dave Larson pointed out they are all statements of action. So I've excerpted here just verses 23 and 24. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they were not afraid of the king's edict. Very action-based. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. And so when you look at that faith chapter, we start each of the phrases with by faith, and then we end with another example of by faith, we break out of the indecision of doubt. And that's the value of faith, is breaking out of the indecision. So my concluding thoughts. I believe doubt can be valuable. It's done tremendous things for Western culture, for science. The fact that we can turn lights on and off in this house or in this building rests on the fact that people in the past doubted and took action based on the doubt. However, doubt can paralyze, particularly in the religious context. When paralyzed by doubt, I believe one should prayerfully take a step forward in any direction. The so-called leap of faith, if it's the correct step, I think one will be farther along the path. If it's not the correct step, faith is a gift, and I think the Lord understands and will intervene to direct the steps back the way they should go. And so with that, I'll close with the final photo, placing an exclamation point from on high. This picture was also taken by my youngest son on vacation, and that exclamation point in the cloud there led to a tremendous amount of doubt from his older two brothers who claimed the photo had been doctored. So in all things, doubt plays its role. But thank you.
Dr. Herrmann, we have a question back here.
Okay.
Well, thank you for a very provocative, helpful talk. I think that I wonder if the distinction between emotion and reason, given what William James has said and other points you've made, isn't really more about what we values than emotion. It seems like emotion doesn't quite capture it. I think in our polarized political climate today, whatever position people feel, I think it becomes evident to me that whatever evidence is pointed out, the side people are going to come down on is pretty predictable based upon their values about a particular side. Or I've tried to equalize my news watching between two channels lately to kind of try to be fair, and the way facts are reported and which facts are reported is very telling. And I try not to hope this isn't a political statement, but I think it has a lot of spiritual implications about how the things we value. It's like some of the spiritual writers have said, if we come to Scripture not valuing the values that Scripture teaches, we will never find them believable. I guess that's the point.
Thanks. I think that's a very, very important point. It seems when people get into a state where they're actually facing doubt, there appears to be a very, very strong desire to rest on something. And so they replace with anger and vitriol what would rest ordinarily on a firm foundation. And then you get ego and all that stuff mixed in. So, I mean, I've been irritated in certain arguments with people, and the guys basically said I take issue with that, and I'm already formulating the counter argument. Doesn't really matter what's coming. And I think that's a very human trait, and strikes at the fact that when one is in doubt and desperately reeling and looking for something to hold on to, it actually makes it highly counterproductive to being able to move in any useful direction. But it's very important.
I have a question. And I struggle with James, not the Apostle James,
No,
but William
yeah.
James.
Well, I did too. It's kind of a loop.
Well, David and I have talked about this, and I respect James. But it seems like we have issues that if we don't have enough doubt, we're going to fall for anything. We have things called cognitive dissonance. We have confirmation bias. And in research, you have to have this blinded, double-blinded. It just seems to me that if we don't have doubt, we're going to fall for anything. And I think also what Hank has said, if we come up with a certain set of beliefs to begin with and just say, well, like Farragut said, blank the torpedoes, full speed ahead, we're just going to lead ourselves into delusion. So that's where my struggle with James. You want to respond to that? Or?
Well, first of all, I found the essay incredibly tough to read. I don't know if you did. I read it 2 or 3 times, and I'm not sure I completely got it even after the 3rd time. But as near as I can tell, James is not saying one shouldn't doubt. It's almost, if I read it correctly, William James is saying you have to figure out where to start to figure out what you believe and don't believe. Make the assumption there's a belief. Now you can doubt it and start looking for the evidence. But like I said, I read it a number of times and I might have misunderstood him. I think, though, that where he was going is somewhat an answer to, Descartes, who was demanding pure deductive reasoning. And Descartes was, if you demand pure deductive reasoning, it's pretty hard to break into any kind of a system that has reality. I mean, you have to have something to compare it to. And so I think William James was saying, well, just go ahead and make the assumption. Nothing wrong with it. Sort of an argument against philosophy of the day. Nothing wrong with making that assumption. But then, now you can sort of doubt it. And he talks a lot about an analogy. I think I liked the article because he talked a lot about an analogy of chemistry. And a chemist that will form a hypothesis and then work for years in a laboratory attempting to demonstrate the hypothesis is no different than a person who decides, I want to have a religious faith, and then spends years trying to figure out if they can build it. But like I said, it was a very, very difficult article for me to read. And it would be nice if Dr. Larson was here and we could kind of get his perspective on it.
Hey, Paul, nice going. I appreciate the academics behind doubt in your presentation. It was really good. But I appreciated very much that you ended up with choose action. And that becomes a challenge for all of us, is how do we choose action? And when we're around distressed friends and people, how do we guide them into some action? We know that getting married is a decision. Life is full of decisions. Falling in love is yet another decision. So in my own thinking, my journey, as I kind of stress about the amount of friends that I've lost, disassociated from believing in God, is I'm trying something very simple, just make a decision approach. So when as I said, a couple of friends that have been distressed with illness, and said, look, Rodney, I'd really like to believe in God. I know that you do, but it's just so silly. I'm so past it. I just feel silly if I believed in God at this stage. And I said, look, all you need to do is make a decision and put yourself in an experimental situation, is just do this for me, or think about doing it. Say that you'll believe in God. Just say that you'll believe in God for a trial of 3 to 6 months. If it doesn't work, let it go. But make that first commitment. I'm going to believe in God. And the second thing is, try and talk to this unseen stranger every day, just for a few minutes. Just pretend. You don't have to believe. Just pretend he's a confidant. And I wanted to see if your life gets better. Let me know if your life gets better after about 3 months. In 2 out of 3 instances, it did. And it's a very simple thing, is make a decision on something very simple. I'll never point them to read to something. Oh, you just need to read this, or you just need to do that, or go and read something else. It doesn't do it for people in distressed situations, looking at the short end of time, who have to, who are full of doubt and immobilized by doubt. So that was one thought. And if you might indulge me for 20 seconds, you threw a pebble in the water when it came to the Basque people. And I've done a kind of an independent sort of study on that for a couple of weeks, a couple of years ago. And it's very interesting, but there's a biblical connection back here, I believe. There are 3 peoples and languages that linguists do not know where the language came from, or even the origins of the people. And as you pointed out, the Basque is one of those. And so contacted the Basque Cultural Center to try and get some information on it as to where they came from. Very, very short, very closed, just don't know. Why don't they know? Of course, there's got to be some investigation. But if you look at their legends, and if you look at their folklore, and if you look at their symbols that are in their literature and in their materials, it all leads back to Mesopotamia. It leads back to the Phoenicians. And behind that, there's the city of Mali. And so you look at who their gods were. The gods were Ninurta and Venus, the goddess of Mali. That's where they came from the trade center. We know the Phoenicians were boat builders. They were traders. They came out of the Mediterranean and spread civilization and traded up and down the Atlantic coast. And so when I looked at some of the linguistic literature of that, they've done themselves, and they said, we're actually the Phoenicians. And they traced their language back to the Tower of Babel, the confusion in tongues experience that the Bible talks about, when God says, let's go down and put a different speech in their mouth. That's where they say, some of the linguists say, that's where they say their language came from. Very interesting to me that the Hungarians and the Finns are the same. People don't know where their language came from. It has no formal structure of any other language, but the phonation of the Finns sounds very much like the Plains Indians. So it becomes very interesting to me how this dispersion of language. But one of the key things to finish off with the Basque is they were whalers. They had whaling stations up in the Newfoundland area back in the 12th and 13th century. And they traded whale oil and whale meat. But the interesting thing to me is they would never eat whale meat themselves. They would sell it, trade it, but not eat it. That comes out of Mesopotamia laws.
Coming over to Peter now. I'll meet you halfway, Peter.
doing your exercise.
It's an added benefit of the class.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for your excellent incursion through philosophy, art, Bible, history. It was exquisite. I'd like to make a few comments in relation with the cart that you mentioned and Sun Tzu, also about faith. In relation with Descartes, he is the father of modernism. The modernists believe they were looking for certitude. They kind of, put aside the Bible and say, I want to experience myself. And he came up with this famous aphorism, cogito ergo sum. Well, it's very surprising because a devout Catholic like René Descartes, instead of coming up with the conclusion, credo ergo cred, because I believe because you exist, that means God, he came up with this aphorism, I believe because I exist. And of course, this is in relation with the one of the main characteristics of the Enlightenment that made man the measure of all things instead of God, which was in the Middle Ages until that time. In relation with Sun Tzu, the Chinese writer of the Art of War, in 1987, 1988, I was teaching American military history at Cal State University in San Bernardino. And they sent me to get a certificate for teaching military history in all universities in this country at West Point Military Academy. And in that place, I discovered that Sun Tzu was not very important for the Asians, as you mentioned, but for the Western too. And a proof for that is that Norman Schwarzkopf, during the First War, he was using closely Tzu strategy, which was basically used by MacArthur during the Korean War when he cut in half Saddam Hussein's troops and isolated one side from the other. Basically, this is what Norman Schwarzkopf did. Now, in relation with the faith that you mentioned at the end, well, we have a wide range of definitions and beliefs about what faith is. In the 11th, 12th century, we have Anselm, one of the fathers of the church, that said credo ut intelligam, which is, I believe, because it's absurd. Of course, we are not in favor really of that. And I would say that faith is not a blind belief. It's a belief based on reason and on facts. And if we look at the facts, the proof, we can find this proof in the nature. As Paul said in Romans, look at the sky, and also C.S. Lewis, as he wonderfully said, that the reason and the starry sky and the reason inside of us. But also not only in the nature, but also in history, in the Bible, and in God's Son, that he came, made oneself one with us, and revealed the Father.
I think that's a very, very important point. You know, the part that Bruinsma referred to in Ellen White's book makes it clear that, there is evidence upon which to base faith. The thing that I hadn't connected quite as much until last time I was here, and Dave Larson mentioned it, is not only, however, is faith something that is based on evidence, but it's a call to action. I mean, to sit in one's chair and say, I have faith, really is not the Christian calling. And so Dave Larson really put me onto this, and when you sort of put that stuff back in that context, you start to realize it's the indecision of doubt that's the real sin. And it's the lack of action based on faith that kind of leads to that indecisive hesitancy that is not helpful to the Christian experience. So, very good points. So when you taught military history, I mean, that must have been kind of an interesting move. How did you manage to land in that?
Well, I love all kind of history. That was my passion. And I was in my master program in national security of the United States at Cal State University in San Bernardino. That was my second master. And I discovered that basically I was taking classes to get recognition first for my master in history and Romanian language that I got in Romania. And I discovered this national security program, and it was an opening. One of the professors that was teaching this class, he got sick, cancer, and I applied for the position because it was open, and it was given to me.
That's neat. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Is it safe to say that truth is relative in that it has political, cultural, educational, and societal components? Also, that truth should be on a continuum because as we learn better, we do better. Therefore, is a modicum of doubt healthy? Because it helps propel inquiry and reach better understanding.
Wow. That's a pretty packed question. My personal view is a modicum of doubt is pretty healthy and helpful when you look at what it's done. I mean, I come from a science tradition, and so, you know, doubt is the basis of what's driven things to be the way they are. Doubt in and of itself, in other words, somebody skeptically looking at something, looking for answers, from my perspective, is not a bad thing, in fact, is a good thing. Doubt, however, if it leads to indecision, particularly in the spiritual realm, is remarkably dangerous. And I will close by mentioning, I have observed over time that nothing in nature is punished more harshly than indecision. So I'll give two examples. One, this summer I took the kids down, there was a Genghis Khan display down at the Reagan Library, and they had the Mongols when they shot them, which were thought to instill terror in the enemy. And so I was looking up where these came from, and they were initially used in hunting. So they would shoot one of these whistling arrows, and the game would stop trying to figure out what it was, which made them a very easy second shot, right? So it's that indecision cost the game its life. The second story I'll tell you is not long after I came back here as a faculty member, there were a group of kids who wound up in the emergency room, or at least a couple of them did. They had attempted to go shopping at the Ontario Mills Mall, but wound up parking on the wrong side of the freeway and decided they would just run across the freeway. The one that didn't make it was the one that got to the middle of the freeway and realized this was a problem and froze. So doubt in and of itself is very healthy if it drives one to think through things and come to conclusive action that's favorable. Doubt is very unhealthy if it causes one to freeze and not be able to function. And I think nowhere is that more true than in the spiritual realm. A person who is constantly toggling, do I believe, do I not believe, do I believe, do I not believe, and because of that toggling takes no action, really misses out on a huge amount of the blessings of the spiritual life.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would say the time for doubt in that young man was prior to stepping foot on the freeway.
Right, that would have been appropriate doubt, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'd like to end today with our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.